All right. Hello, everyone. It is officially noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am. So the time to say good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the managing director here at the program on negotiation, and very delighted today to be uniting our community in celebration of the new book by Attia Qureshi and John Richardson, Never Settle. And I will introduce in just a minute the authors of this program. But first, a big welcome to everyone, whether you are returning to PON or whether this is your first experience with us. As many of you know, the program on negotiation has been the world's leading research center in negotiation, mediation, and conflict management research for over 40 years now. And we put on a variety of events from research opportunities. We had a pedagogy seminar with our faculty just last night, executive education programs, and then free webinars open to the public, such as this one in celebration of scholarship, research, and new findings in the fields that we study. So I would like to take this moment, as ever, to thank the incredible PON staff who does so much work. It's quite an effort to put on one of these shows, and our team is very expert. Big thanks to CJ Bigsby and to Luis Reyes today for all of their support. We will be gathered today for an hour from noon Cambridge time to 1 p.m. And our authors and panelists will have the chance to present their work for about 40 minutes. At the conclusion of that period, we will have a 20 or so minute question and answer session. So if you have a question for our speakers at any time, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the PON website in just about a week. So if you need to leave at any point, if you join us late, if you want to send it to a friend, you will be able to share all of that as well. All right, and I think I've gotten through all of the wonderful logistical things, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our two speakers and the authors today, Attia Qureshi and John Richardson, for their really exciting new work, Never Settle, which I have to say, I read a lot of negotiation materials. This is a very practical, not only summary of many of the skills that those of us in this field know, but way to put into practice a lot of the things that we teach in the classroom and filled with a lot of exercises to try out at home on your colleagues, loved ones, people you meet in the supermarket to hone your negotiation skills and further your learning. So Attia Qureshi and John Richardson met at MIT, where John is a lecturer in work and organization studies at the Sloan School of Management. Attia now has since moved on to become a lecturer at the University of Michigan, Gerald Ford's School of Public Policy. And they have continued to be a dynamic duo and really have such a wonderful relationship that comes across in the course of their work and in the course of their presentation today. So I now would like to invite them on screen, and I will exit stage left for a little bit while they present their wonderful work. So Attia and John, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Nicole.
We're really excited to be here.
Yeah, especially really excited. We've been doing a lot of podcasts the last couple of weeks to promote the book. But it seems like we have to spend about half the time of the podcast explaining what interests are, in basic negotiation lingo. But here, we feel like we're with our home crowd. And we can really focus on what we wrote the book for initially was as an adjunct to our classes. And we'll talk about, the origin of why we wanted to do that. But we're really hoping to help you think about using this or something like this in your teaching. And if you don't teach any negotiation classes, it's also very relevant for teaching yourself better negotiation skills. But I quit my job as a litigator in Manhattan to make a lot less money teaching negotiation. And our theory was, well, but we're changing the world instead of helping, rich, sleazy characters fight over securities fraud. But we had a fear. And it's maybe a fear that a lot of you have experienced as well, which is, what if we're not saving the world? What if we teach them these ideas and they're great ideas and they love it. And they give us very high student ratings, and they're completely convinced by what we're teaching, but it doesn't actually change them. And one of the things that really disquieted me about that, a lot of you know the sales exercise. You say to students, okay, you have 1 minute, sell something off your desk, like this pen, to the person next to you. And what almost all of them will do is just talk the whole time. Oh, it's a great pen. It's a great color. It works really well. And they don't ask any questions. They don't do anything to learn about the counterpart's interests. And so then you talk about that and say, oh my gosh, that's so, isn't that foolish? You'd be much better off asking questions and listening to them, at least as a first step. And they're all convinced. They go, oh my gosh, that's so true. And we tell lots of examples about times that was really important to the outcome of a negotiation. And then you give them basically the same exercise in a disguised form the next week, and they do exactly the same thing again, and they don't change anything. And at least for me, I'm always worried about, they seem to understand everything and they seem to agree with it, but how do I know anything is actually changing for them? Um, then I had an experience. Some of you guys know Chris Voss and the Black Swan Group. He's a retired FBI negotiator. And I got to go with him to the UAE to help them teach hostage negotiation. And because I knew a lot about the research and I could just say, hey, the research agrees with everything you guys are saying. But obviously I'm not an expert hostage negotiator like those guys were. But I was really stunned because they got enormous behavioral change out of their audience very, very quickly. And so I thought, okay, it's not that it's impossible to change people, it's the way that we're doing it isn't changing them enough. And what can we learn from these guys? And what I saw is um, they boiled everything down into very, very concrete micro skills. And then they drilled them again and again and again. In essence, they were teaching negotiation the way that I used to coach Little League. Teaching it like a sport or like how to play a musical instrument. And compared to other classes at law school or business school, we were already much more practical, much less lecture, a lot more hands-on. But these guys were even farther down that road. And so then I started thinking, well, the diagnosis for why we're not getting as much behavioral change as I want is because, for one thing, it's too complicated. We give people negotiations to do, case studies to do in class, and then we review them. And usually these case studies are focused on different issues, whatever we talked about in the lecture earlier that day. Um, but it's still a very complex set of skills that they're trying to master all at once. Whereas, if you're coaching Little League, first you have, if you're trying to teach them how to bat, you say, okay, first you're just going to stand at the plate and I'm going to pitch to you and you watch the ball and tell me where it went. Okay, now I'm going to hold out a ball on a stick and you just move the bat to hit that wherever I put it so that we know that you can reach wherever you want to reach with it. Okay, then we're going to combine those and you build up little bit at a time. Um, and then you just need to practice it again and again. Now, the thing about that course at the UAE is the UAE government was spending, huge amounts of money to get all these retired hostage negotiators to come teach them. Most of us probably don't have, $200,000 per person that a government's willing to spend on us. Um, so we need to find a less expensive way to do that constant drill and practice. And it needs to be inviting enough that students will be willing to keep doing it again and again and again. And then lastly, I think a lot of us have the problem of when they walk into our class, students are entering a different culture. And students will say things to us like, oh, yeah, yeah, the stuff you're talking about works on other people in this negotiation class, but that's different than the people out there in the real world. And there is something about their different culture and different expectations within a negotiation class. And so we really wanted to get students taking the stuff from class immediately out into the real world to try it. And so what we ended up designing was, oh yeah, Attia and I started teaching together. It was during COVID. And so all the students were going completely crazy from not talking to anybody in their real life. And so we were also designing something to get them talking to people in the real world. Um, and even though COVID's gone away now, I think we still have that problem with young people that they're, heads down on their phone all the time and not talking to other humans. And so I think that's another benefit of these exercises is you get people off their phone and still getting the same kind of tiny little bursts of dopamine that get you addicted to your phone, but it's a healthy addiction because it's building relationships with real people. And so our design for this is we try to break all the skills, like focus on interests down into very discrete micro skills and then give them little challenges to try on other people in their environment, manipulate your friends and family. Um, and then, we have them as their written homework talk about what they tried and what their results were. And for us, that's a lot more entertaining than reading another analysis of Sally Soprano, and what happened in that negotiation. Um, Atia, anything to add there? And then we can start talking about some of these examples of exercises that we use.
Yeah, I think I would just add that when we started applying this to our students, we saw rapid behavior change when
Yeah.
they were applying these skills in low stakes, real world environments. And that really encouraged us to continue to expand and then put this into a book format because we figured what we want to do is drive that behavioral change. And as John described, as a performance skill, figuring out how to make that work for them and breaking it down using the seven elements framework but then supporting that through some stories and exercises that we embedded into the book seemed to really resonate with the students and see results. So, with that, we can dive into a breakdown of what we showcase in the book.
Sure. So the first one we start with, probably like a lot of you teach negotiation, and I learned this from Roger Fisher and Bruce Patton. First day is oil pricing. Which is most of an exercise of it's kind of an iterated prisoner's dilemma. And one of the lessons that really comes up is how quickly other people copy your behavior. And Cialdini's concept of reciprocity really dominates what happens in the exercise. And so the homework for that night is go home and start doing, sending a 30 in oil pricing terms to people in your environment. And the first exercise is start giving little gifts to people in your environment. Before you come to class or to a meeting, you're going to stop and get coffee, get 2 cups of coffee and give one to whoever's sitting next to you. And then just watch and see what happens after that and see if they feel that compulsion that Cialdini talks about to do something nice for you in return. And, reading student responses to this is tremendously entertaining because they typically get all kinds of stuff that people do for them. One that I thought was really, really interesting. We had an international student from Japan, and one night she was going to make tonkatsu, this traditional, Japanese noodle soup. And so she decides to make an extra big batch of it. And she goes across the hall in graduate student housing and gives some of the soup to these 2 guys who live across the hall from her. About a week later, there was a big blizzard in Boston. And so she gets her shovel and goes down to shovel her car out in the parking lot. And it's already been shoveled out. And there's a note on her windshield from the guys across the hall saying, that soup was fantastic. And that's the kind of thing Attia is talking about what makes students keep repeating this behavior is they almost always get some kind of reward from their interaction with other people. And so you don't, we start them as saying you have to do this to turn it in as graded work. But then they typically end up still doing it again and again and again. The next one we usually say, but that's more of actually, Attia, could you go back a slide? Um, that's one exercise we do for the reciprocity. What we typically do after each class, I think we have 37 exercises in the book, but we'll give, if we have 11 or 12 classes over the course of a semester, we group the exercises together and give people a chance to pick, what's the one they want to do. The other one we recommend is if you're in an ongoing relationship and you're unhappy with the level of cooperation in that relationship, like maybe your roommate leaves the sink full of dirty dishes, or, maybe your sister never calls you to connect with you. Um, the next assignment is just start doing whatever the behavior is that you want them to imitate. So do the dishes that they left in the sink for you. Only, there's a couple conditions on it. You have to make it visible to them. It usually doesn't help if you clean out the vegetable drawer because they don't even notice because it's way in the back of the fridge. You want to do the dishes in front of them and not say anything about it, not make any passive aggressive remarks. Just do the dishes with a cheerful smile on your face and see if that makes them uncomfortable enough that they jump up and start helping you, or they start doing it yourself the next time. Or, after 2 weeks of calling your sister to connect, to see if she calls you back. And that typically, you get a lot of traction out of the roommates in this, or at least that's what our students report to us is, yeah, I only had to do the dishes 2 times. And then, they were doing them without me asking. Although there was a very funny interaction we had where there was a house full of Eastern European guys, MIT engineers, and they were from Lithuania and Russia and Bulgaria, and they were all in our negotiation class. And they started like thinking about anything that any of them did, the others would accuse of doing them as a manipulation technique that they were doing as homework for our class. So uh, the, I found that amusing. I don't know if that's really what we were hoping for with the exercise, but it was funny to read about. And that's the other thing that we really like about this stuff as instructors is that you end up getting, kind of hilarious windows into the students' lives. And it's also like this is stuff that's hard. I wouldn't say impossible, but harder than most written assignments for them to fake with AI. Some students will try to do that, but we had one student who said there was an exercise on saying no. And he was like, "Oh, a friend of mine and this was a guy. And he said, a friend of mine invited me to go to a pregnancy yoga thing with them, but I felt I was too big and pregnant to go to this pregnancy yoga thing." And I'm like, okay, dude, like you're not selling this to anybody. Um, so I think it's sort of harder to fake and easier to spot the fakes, and that's a nice thing. And then the last one we usually do is was taught to me by someone that many of you know, Sheila Heen, who teaches negotiation at Harvard Law and is my wife. And when we first got married, she would, say things like, "Hey, the garbage is getting pretty full. It would be sure nice if somebody took that garbage out." We'd be sitting on the couch watching TV when we said this. And I'd be like, "Yeah, you're sitting right here too. Like, you got 2 arms and 2 legs. Why don't you go take it out?" And so, because that's what a wonderful husband I am. But then she started a different technique is she would wait until I was in the kitchen and she would start unloading the dishwasher, which is a chore that I don't like. And then she would say, "Hey, while I'm doing this, could you take out the garbage?" And that triggers that Cialdini reciprocity, reflex in me. And at the same time, it makes it impossible for me to say, "Well, why don't you do it?" Because she's already busy doing something that I want her to keep doing. Um, and then, she would always get me to take out the garbage that way. And it's interesting that Cialdini talks about this, but people have this, what they call accounting insensitivity, that when people have that feeling of reciprocity indebtedness, that they owe you something, now they need to give you something back. But Cialdini says that because of accounting insensitivity, they're not good at tracking how much they got and how much they're giving back. So later I realized that my wife was doing things like, "Hey, while I'm unloading this dishwasher, could you get me new snow tires on my car?" And I'd be like, "Sure." And, I'd be drinking coffee in the tire shop waiting room before I thought, wait a minute. Like, what did she just do to me? Um, and so that's also, entertaining kind of stuff that you can hear from your students. Now, ordinarily I would stop and ask for questions, but I guess we're saving all that till the end. But Atia, do you want to take us on to the next bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, with interests, if we jump to the next segment, we focus heavily on our own interests and their interests. And what we found, we decided to categorize it in two ways. The first was what I think of as the internal negotiation that students don't necessarily think about, and what is stopping them before they get started. Because there often is a big emotional response to negotiation. I don't know if it's because often in our day and age, we see it in the news or we see it on TV or in movies where it feels like it's something that's super adversarial. And we want to change the way that people perceive it, that it's in our daily lives in small moments and small ways. And there's a relational path forward, this idea of a principled path forward. So we start by asking them to think about what are those emotions that crop up, and the simplest exercise when it comes to that is the emotion label. So we provide them with an emotion wheel in the book and ask them to think through as many emotions that they can categorize as possible that might be spreading within them before they enter a negotiation. And through the emotion label, how when they write it down, or even better, when they say it out loud over and over again, that can help them regulate their entire systems and be more prepared to enter into that conversation. So that would be kind of understanding that deeper level of their interests and their emotional reaction to negotiation. And then, of course, we go into the typical understanding of our own interests. And we found that students actually have a pretty hard time clearly identifying their interests rather than digging into a position. And we wanted to help them through specific exercises on, yes, we understand that you do have this position. What are the drawbacks of digging into that position? It doesn't really make it a negotiation, but just you know, an ability for someone to say yes or no to you. And rather, what is the simplest form? Pick something small that you have coming up. And I actually give an example in the book about a decision I had to make of moving from Boston to Traverse City because I met this cherry and apple farmer who was wonderful and based in rural northern Michigan, which was a huge change for me after teaching with John at MIT and living in big cities. And John actually gave me advice. He's like, well, have you listed out your interests? And I was like, oh, yeah. And so I should follow my own advice. And so taking the time to list out my interests and giving them the advice, which I took myself of ranking those interests, weighting those interests, and picking any decision, small or big, that they can practice that on so they can start identifying those things before walking into the negotiation. And then, even better from there, showing that list to the person who might be part of that decision or other people who know you well. So I showed my list of interests to my sister who knows me really well. I showed it to that farmer's sister who understands what it's like to live in Traverse City and grow up there, but still be a professional building her career. And that helped me really understand and further flesh out what those interests would be. So we provide stories like that in the book that feel they really resonate with the students and the readers, and they understand how the scope of negotiation is broader than they necessarily thought about. And then those exercises that build upon each other, but can start really low stakes and get progressively more complex and teach them the skill along the way. John,
Yeah,
anything you want to add to that?
just that MIT's loss was Michigan's gain, and now you have Zavion. So
That's true. That's true. I didn't tell you all the end of the story, but I did end up moving to Traverse City and working at the University of Michigan and now have a 2-year-old. So it did work out. But I think going through that list and being able to put the work in there really helped me make the decision. And John, I'll pass it off to you if you want to talk about their interests.
sure, and this is, of course, it's useful for students to start thinking about their interests, especially when they're in early stages of their career, when they can still make shifts like that. Um, but as everyone who teaches negotiation would probably tell you, um, the silver bullet is figuring out what their interests are, and that's what really empowers you. And I should also mention, as a background, we have, because the book is written for a general audience, not only as an adjunct to a negotiation class. We do a lot of explaining about, basic negotiation theory, but we're not trying to come up with anything, particularly new or groundbreaking there. It's more, what's the conventional wisdom among people who do this for a living? If we took the 600 people on this Zoom right now and took the average of their negotiation advice, like that's what we mean to be in the book. What do we all agree on that students can benefit from? But on this thing of figuring out their interests, what we want to do is get students in the habit of constantly thinking about the interests of everybody, that they interact with. Like, in that movie, The Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a robot, but whenever he talks to a person, there's like a drop down list appears in his point of view, with possible things he could say. We want, every time you look at any other person, we want the students to have a drop down list of what are this person's interests and what's motivating them. And the way we try to build that is actually an exercise that was invented by one of our TAs back in the day. This was back when I was teaching at Harvard in the 90s. Um, and it was the day that we were teaching Sally Soprano, and and what we usually do is a seven element prep by side in advance of that. And when they got to the part in this class about, well, okay, what are the other side's interests? One of the students said to this TA, Natasha Cohn, well, but you can't know what their interests are. And Natasha said, yeah, but you can guess. And he goes, oh, your guesses will be meaningless. That'll be terrible. And on the spot, she invented this exercise, which was Natasha had really long, beautiful red hair. Like, I'm not sure if it was long enough for her to sit on, but it was close. And it was very striking. And she said, I've had this long red hair for my entire life, but I've been thinking of cutting it off and getting a pixie cut instead. Why don't you tell me? We'll make a list, reasons I want to cut it off and reasons I don't want to cut it off, and we'll see how close you get. And the class made their guesses, and about 90% of them were correct, were on the list. There were a couple where she was like, no, I'm not worried about the cost of getting a haircut because I'll get my mom to pay for that at her stylist. And then there were a couple on there. She was like, I didn't even think of that. That should be on my list. And so we suggest that as an exercise, pick out a problem that you're facing, a hard decision, and ask somebody to guess what your reasons for and against are. And you'll typically benefit from their guesses. You may learn things that should be on your list that aren't. But then after you model that behavior, flip it around and ask them to describe a decision that they're faced and see if you can guess what their pros and cons are on making that decision. And that's a great way to build up this habit of consistently analyzing for the other person's interests. And it also typically makes you know the other person a lot better. And it also typically makes you like them more, because the more you understand about someone's motivations, the more transparent they are to you, typically, the better you like them. And that's actually a lot of students have reported that this is a great exercise to do on a first date. When you meet somebody on Tinder or Bumble, try this out with them, and you'll know pretty soon whether they're the right kind of person for you. It's also a great thing to do on a long car trip with your kids. This is a really fun one to pass the time, and a lot of people will end up returning to it again and again just because it's amusing to do. But that's, and somebody else's decision is a lot easier than when it's a shared decision, especially a shared decision with someone who's really important to you. And so another one we like to do is to say, in an ongoing conflict that you have, with your partner, with your kids, with your parents, see if you can write out for them what all their interests are that are relevant to this ongoing argument and and then show it to them and let them tell you how close you got. And the really interesting thing is this will typically frequently take students, if they're doing it with their husband or wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, about a week to get right, of going through iterations of describing their interests in such a way that they'll say, yeah, you got it correct. And I think one of the reasons are that is because when we're in a conflict, we tend to, even if we get their interests right, we'll describe it in less charitable terms. if you think about the way Republicans and Democrats describe each other's interests, they're not entirely wrong, but they always make it, oh, they have an evil, stupid interest in this or that. But that's definitely not the way that the people who have that interest think about it. And this is another one that leads to really, really entertaining student results to listen to. One of them that really struck me, there was a student, she was a doctor from Egypt, and she was taking a year at MIT studying, she took, I forget what else she was studying, but she was in our negotiation class. And her mother, who had a very successful business back home, was paying her tuition. And she called her mom and said, hey, actually, I'm having a really good time. I'm really learning a lot, and I want to stay for another year. And her mother was like, absolutely not. And she was trying to figure out, what that was. And so we said, hey, why don't you try this exercise on her? Um, and of course, it turned out it wasn't about the money at all. And what she ended up, laying out for her mom is, I'm in this very alien nation with a very different culture and, a different dominant religion. And you're worried that the more I stay here, the more I'm becoming one of them. And you're worried that I won't even be your daughter anymore. I'll be some different person who's been infected, with American ideas, which are, not really good for me. And her mother was like, yes, thank God you finally understand. All right, fine, you can stay another year. And it was just knowing, what the being able to describe what her mother was worried about that was enough to assuage her mother's fears. I think actually that reminds me of so Sheila and I have a vacation house up in New Hampshire, and we've got a boat. And when we first got the boat, we had huge fights all the time because whoever was driving the boat, the other person would be a terrible backseat driver and be like, "No, turn left. You got to turn left." And what we ended up agreeing on as a rule is that you can't tell them how to drive, how fast, or to turn left or right, but you can say, do you see that buoy over there? Do you see that boat coming towards us? And as long as I know you see it, then I know you have it and you can take care of it. And I think that exercise like gives the other person the comfort that like, okay, you see the buoy. Now I can trust you to handle it.
One thing I'll add into that is I've seen a lot of success with this exercise for people that are in corporate settings, especially because in those situations, they're dealing with colleagues who might not be picking up the slack in, a joint project or thinking through how they want to negotiate a promotion or a new job offer. And this is really helpful in those cases because they go in and they build themselves up and have exactly what they want to say, and they're ready to just lay it all out there. But taking a step back and thinking through the interests of the other party really helps reset the stage for them to open up the entire environment of the negotiation and make it an actual conversation, which is a lot more productive than narrowing it to their idea of what they should be talking about and explaining and over explaining to whoever they're working with.
Yeah, and what's rewarding for us is you only have to give the students one or two real world experiences of that happening, and then they're hooked in a way that, figuring out what Sally Soprano really wants doesn't hook them in the same way.
Oh, John, you're really going at it for Sally. Poor
Ah,
Sally. Well, we have objective criteria and
yeah.
options in here, but I'm actually going to get us to alternatives and then wrap up because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. You will also get this deck along with a handout. So those will be sent your way. So don't worry, you'll have access to all of this. I want to end with alternatives because of the power with building alternatives and having the ability to say no. And we cover both. And John and I actually went back and forth on if we would do it in one chapter or separate chapters. We had a long debate about it and we ended up
Yeah,
doing
you
separate.
won.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted separate chapters because it feels like two skills that are complementary but distinct. We have one chapter on building alternatives and getting comfortable with the option of walking away and saying no, and then another chapter on how to say no. Because one thing we ask our students was, how many of you have a hard time saying no? And John, I don't know, somewhere between 75 and 90% of the classroom would always raise their hand.
Something like that.
Yeah. And so if we talk about the just saying no, we wanted to give them an opportunity to figure out how do I go and say no? And one of the exercises we give, which I love the responses we get from this one as well, is just a firm, flat no. The next time your best friend calls you, or spouse, or someone with a relationship that can withstand some pressure asks you for something, you give a firm, flat no.
With no
No equivoc
explanation.
Yeah, no equivocating, no explanation. Of course, they can go back later and explain, but what we want them to do is get inoculated to the feeling and the fear of saying no, because then when they go and give a polite no, it's so much easier than that firm, flat no. So that's one practice we want to give them to get them more comfortable, because I think that at the end of the day, a lot of us say yes when we don't necessarily want to. And we end up in a difficult situation down the road because we are agreeable. We want to make others happy, and fighting that instinct, especially in a negotiation where we want them to get a good deal, not just any deal, is really important for them to have the capability to be able to say that. And then also building alternatives, because having an alternative in your back pocket is just building confidence. It's like armor around you. You walk in and they can smell it on you because you have that confidence of knowing you can walk away and you have something else that you can go to. And so, how do we want them to do that? Well, if you say, you need to go find another job offer, that feels incredibly difficult and challenging. It feels way too big to approach. So, how do we break that down into the smallest skills? What is the first step you could take? Could you just look on LinkedIn and see if you have connections at companies that you're interested in? Whatever the smallest step people could take is into developing alternatives can be very powerful in moving them forward in that process, because usually once we start that first step, we keep going and do a lot more than we expect. And so it's breaking that down into really an accessible way to build yourself an alternative. John, anything else you want to add to saying no or alternatives?
No, I think you covered it.
Awesome. So, with that, we want to just say that this is just a start for us. We hope that this is a start of a category, because there's so much amazing theory out there in negotiation, and we had a hard time deciding what we were going to put in this book and not put in this book. And there were a lot of things that we had to cut, but we were able to get 37 exercises in, and these are the ones that we have tried and vetted with our students for a really long time that we know work. And we know that you also can come up with exercises, and many of you probably already have exercises that you run in your classes that are really effective at getting that behavioral change. And so we see this as something that's progressing and evolutionary.
Yes, we're looking for other people's books on the same topic. And, or maybe we should probably start a website where everybody can, put
Yeah.
all theirs in. And, there's some sort of mechanism for hosting
Mm.
everybody's ideas on this. We can all learn from each other and as instructors.
Oh, I think that's a great idea. And so, as a wrap up, what we hope you take away from this is that the book really focuses on practice. We do share a light amount of theory just so that they have an understanding, a foundational understanding on the seven elements, but we frame it as a performance skill that they need to improve upon using these small exercises in low stakes environments in their daily life. And just like a musician or an athlete, the improvement is going to come from those repetitions in the real world. And we do focus on very specific micro exercises. So between classes, we give them homework that allows them to go and practice the skill rather than thinking about it in their head, which we found a lot of students practice lines in their head, or rehearse what they want to do but don't actually apply it. And the application is where you realize, this is where I messed up, this is where I can improve later, and that's the growth mechanism that we've seen. And that these skills compound, that it not only affects the professional environment, but it changes how they show up in work, in relationships, at home, with neighbors, with themselves. And I think that one thing that really compelled me when I learned about this originally from John was this idea that we're improving the way people function and interact with each other in general. And if people started applying even a fraction of these skills, what we're talking about is improving value and creating value for everyone and more people. And that ripple effect that continues when that application broadens is amazing and can drive real meaningful change and improvement just in the way we all treat each other and work with each other. So that was always that I think John talks about it as Fisher's goal and his kind of crusade, and I was very bought into that. And our publisher, Simon and Schuster, can also get you a digital and physical copy. So we have a way you can request a physical or digital copy. So this will again be shared with you in the PowerPoint slides and a handout, but just so you know that if this is of interest and getting to learn more about it and potentially applying it, you can get access to this.
Great.
John,
Now I think we can hand back to Nicole for Q&A.
perfect.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you both for such a wonderful conversation, and we have great questions already in the Q&A, and I know many more that will be coming in. So thank you very much for this presentation, and I look forward to digging in further. We have a first question around the theme of reciprocity, and I'm sure that everyone who's ever had a roommate, partner, or dishwasher not unloading person in their life was taking notes and asking questions. But one specifically that came in at the time when you were talking about this from Andrea about wanting to know if you have any advice for when people, despite all efforts, are somehow too slow on the uptake to read or understand maybe the signs that you're giving them by demonstrating all the things that you're doing. And specifically, an example of, I would like my sister to call me from time to time. So, how can we model, in a way that is for the obtuse to make sure they get the hint?
Attia, do you want to start off?
Sure. I think that what the way John framed it progressively is really helpful. And when you do the action in front of them, and see if you get a response. Sometimes, and often we find you will get that response, but sometimes you won't. And so that's where I think the progressive step that John talked about, that Sheila so, smoothly used was the asking while I do this. And is there a form of that with a relationship, so with your sister, that you could employ if she's not getting the hint because you're the one that's constantly calling and not getting a response? And I think this reminds me of Adam Grant's givers, takers, and matchers. And while we think most people will match when you become a giver and try to, create a really virtuous cycle of reciprocity, there might be some takers out there. And so it's always good to remember that when you do make these efforts, we think it's important to give it a few tries. Handful of times you make an effort with a small gesture to try to change their behavior, but at a certain point, if they don't and they remain a taker, then it might not be the right move, the right negotiation move with them. John, what
Yeah.
do you want to add to that?
Well, I think seeing people's response to this is extremely valuable behavior about them or valuable information about them. If you've got a roommate and no matter how many times you do the dishes in front of them, they never do the dishes, well, maybe you need to get a new roommate next year. Now, with your sister, you're not getting a new sister, so you're stuck with trying to fix this. At the end of the day, your sister's her own person, and she may not want the same relationship that you do. And, if nothing works, you may have to accept that. But at least for me, I would say, well, if it's my sister and I have to be the one to always make the call, and I wish she would call me some of the time, but she won't, well, I maybe I'll just keep calling her and I'll have to love her and forgive her anyway because I want to have that relationship with her.
Yeah, and this actually reminds me of one more thing because you mentioned oil pricing here. And when we run oil pricing, the two teams can't communicate. They can't talk to each other. So
Yeah.
they're operating in silos. But eventually, we give them the opportunity to have a conversation. And we ask the students at the end, did you talk about process? did you actually discuss how you both countries can work together and move forward? And I think there's something to be said for the sister example where you can communicate with each other. And so maybe you try these couple of things, but then you go back to the idea of, have you had a conversation about process? Have you actually just explicitly talked about your relationship and what you're hoping for as a framework for communication and hear her perspective and her interests?
Yeah. And I also think talking about it in terms of your interests might help there. Because if you say, hey, how come I always call you? Why are you such a bad sister? I'm such a good sister to you. That's going to make her even less likely to want to call you. But if you say, remember that time you called me? That made me so happy. When you call me, I just love it. Then there's an implicit reward for her in doing it, and you might get more traction that way.
Mm. Great. Thank you so much. We have a number of questions, and we're going to probably dive into different areas here that are around audience. So you've mentioned negotiation faculty and instructors, and how students could put this into practice. But I don't think this book is just for instructors or students. And specifically, we have a question about, can these skills and exercises be used to build in a culture, in an organization, for example, reciprocity. And so I'd love to hear how you conceived of the audience. I know here at PON and in this setting, it's great to be able to talk to people who are sort of in the game, and we have some specific questions that I'll go into later. But I'd love to hear how you were thinking about this as you were writing. Who is the intended audience?
Yeah. There's an interesting example of that. Roger Fisher, who I used to work for, my mentor, he told me he was writing a book and the title was Guide to International Mediation. And then, he thought about it and thought, well, okay, we can sell one to the Secretary General of the UN and one to the Pope, and then we're done basically with selling this book. So they rewrote it and dropped the reading level of the book from graduate student level to seventh grade level. And that was getting the yes. And they did really well by recalibrating it for a more general audience. Originally, the concept was this was for negotiation instructors, for homework to give your students to do that will actually make them change. Um, and of course, our publisher is like, okay, how many of those people are there? There's a couple thousand. Yeah, that's not doing it. So you have to add in, you have to do the Cliff Notes version of negotiation theory. This is what interests are. This is what reciprocity is. This is what criteria are. So that it is useful for a general audience. And so we've tried to build it out to anybody that's interested in learning negotiation can basically have a self-taught negotiation course by going through the book.
Yeah.
Attia?
Yeah, what I would add to that is I've built my consulting practice, and part of that practice is negotiation training. And I've had clients pre-purchase this book already with the goal of providing workshops and trainings and fireside chats using these concepts in the content. And it can be tailored in different ways. So some want pure negotiation, some really want to focus on understanding reciprocity, my interest, their interest, because that's what an internal organization culture needs to better work together and collaborate and not become so divisive or at each other's throats when resources are scarce. So it can absolutely be tailored to a more corporate environment for trainings and for their population group because first we did write it so that it's accessible to everyone. We wanted to make sure that it's not so academic that it becomes for this group alone, but rather it becomes more of a general business self-help book. And it is a great tool to drive that behavioral change within organizations as well, because they also want to see these improvements within their cultures where people are using these skills internally. So I found a lot of success with my own clients with it.
Mm,
One
great.
thing I'd add to that is, you know, what top management does trickles down in any corporation. But in a sense, the CEO of a company is a bit bound by their role in the corporation. And so we would say, CEO, do this stuff on your friends and family first. Practice all these exercises, and when they become natural, you'll start doing them at work. And then, your direct reports will start copying you, and their direct reports will start copying them, and that's how you change the culture.
Lovely. One thing that I think your book really underscores is the need for preparation, which is a big theme in negotiation instruction. And we have a number of questions around um, how you would take these concepts to design a negotiation. So I'd love to hear, whether you're instructing students about how to prepare, some of the takeaways that folks could have from this book in terms of going into something and before you get there. And I know that's kind of broad, but I'm synthesizing a few different requests.
Sure. I mean, I think one lens on preparation is, the one that Fisher and Patton came up with, going through a seven element checklist. I tend to use five of them as most of the backbone of preparation. I think interests, options, criteria, interests, options, criteria, alternatives. I forgot what for a minute there. And then I think about, what questions I want to ask them as a communication thing. That's preparation for a particular negotiation. And we have that framework at the back of the book. We think that's a tremendously useful thing for people to do. But then there's preparing yourself by skilling up. Our original title for the book was Level Up, but it turned out that we can't use that title because it was the name of a government program in the UK. But our idea was, in addition to prepping for each negotiation, you want to prepare yourself to be a better negotiator. And you could think of, Fisher's elements as a guide to that too. You want to improve your skill at investigating interests, improve your skill at deploying criteria. And so it's a different, I think, additive take on what you do in preparation. Tia?
One thing I would add to that is, like John's mentioned in the back, we do have a really quick seven elements prep sheet in there. And we ask whoever's reading it to identify their goal, because a lot of times people forget what their goal is in a negotiation. Shocking. And then, in addition to that, in the last chapter, we give them options on how they create their own playbook or their own skill set for improving. And we give them options on how they might think about it. So maybe they want to go in order of the book because that's how we wrote it. Maybe that is resonant to them. Maybe they want to pick the skill that they feel is hardest and they know that this is the one I really need to work on. Or we say, why don't you ask someone in your life? I bet they would love to give you advice on where you can improve upon these skills and let them choose. So we also provide a mechanism in the last chapter of how they can create their own curriculum for improvement going forward.
Yeah, our initial thought was we wanted to have, the couch to 5K, program of training. But the
Totally.
problem is that, negotiation is so different. Our skill sets are so different and the situations we face are so different that it's, we don't know that you're doing a 5K. Maybe you're playing tennis, maybe it's pickleball. But we have, a set of variables to think about in designing your own program.
Wonderful. All right, I do want to make sure we ask some questions that are being framed from our negotiation instructor colleagues because they are
Okay.
excited that you're here and going to put your book into practice. So first up, Stevenson Carlbach. Sheila.
Stevenson.
Yeah.
What's up, buddy?
Yeah. Hey, Stevenson. All right. Love this. The focus on building skills is crucial. What do you think about using third person perspective like video as a way of students seeing how they come off? For example, people fear that seeing no will seem incredibly harsh, but when they see or hear themselves doing it, they might realize it ain't so bad. Thoughts?
I think that's a great thing to do. And I mean, we used to spend, I remember back in the 90s when we were teaching at Harvard, we would have to get the AV department to bring in all these giant cameras and videos. And then, and it's just become so cheap and so easy to film yourself. That's a tremendously valuable thing to do in class. And I bet yeah, and I always thought of it that way. There's a lot of room to design how to use a program for how to use video in training yourself. We haven't gotten that far yet, I'd say. So yeah, that's for the next book. Stevenson, we got a collaboration here.
There you
I know.
go.
I think that's exactly right. We need to put an asterisk. and you can film yourself running these exercises because we do mention that to our students in class
Yeah.
and, hey, set it up and or have someone else hold it and film yourself. Most of them never want to watch it, but that's the next step is
Yeah.
you'll really improve when you see
Oh,
it.
good. Well, we heard it here first. We've designed the sequel already. So lovely. Another question from Charles Lyons, who says he's very excited to use this. How has using this approach changed your allocation in class time? Between lectures, micro exercises, are you spending more time on this, than role plays and simulations? How has that worked?
I have I have 90-minute lectures, and have split it up into having lecture in the beginning from somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, then an opportunity somewhere between 40 to, depending on the simulation, 40 to 60 minutes. And then I would say the remainder, I try to give at least 20, ideally 30 minutes at the end of class for an exercise that they can do with their classmates. And then, of course, at the end, they get homework to take away and do, and then they write about that in their journal. So I do love to have, I mean, the lecture is important, the simulations are important because those are exercises that they're employing with their classmates in a scenario base. But then I do like to provide time at the end for an exercise. And then the homework is crucial and required outside of class.
Yeah. And I like to spend the first 10 minutes of every class talking about what happened in your homework. And typically students have hilarious stories like some of the ones we've shared. And that tends to build a lot of enthusiasm for doing the homework. And especially hearing other people's, when it went terribly and was a disaster, that, is comforting to people that, the worst thing that can happen is I'll have a funny story to tell to the class. They really enjoy that with each other. But then we also later in the semester, at first they're writing journals about what happened in their homework, and we're reading them and commenting on them. And about halfway through the semester, we have them switching to reading and commenting on each other's journals. Because, what we always hear from our TAs is, I learned a lot in the class, but I learned 10 times as much when I was a TA. So we're trying to give everybody a little bit of that TA experience by acting as advisors to each other.
And then one more thing we do, not at the beginning, but probably midway through, similarly, are fish bowls, where we have people come up to the front of the class and practice and give feedback on what they saw that went really well, what were areas of improvement. We get people up there to try again. And so those exercises too are really impactful.
Mm, That's great. All right. Well, we probably have time for one more question. And I will say one of the questions that speaks to something I liked about this book is, John, you trace sort of your, negotiation learnings through your time coming out of Harvard Law School and, interacting with so many founders of our field and of the program on negotiation itself. But then you also talk about how a fateful meeting with Chris Voss ended up being a very instrumental learning moment for you and then collaboration in your life as a co-teacher. So we have a specific question from Tom's who would love to know, what was the aha moment for you of meeting Chris and these two sort of negotiation approaches coming together? I know that's probably a lot to distill into just one answer, but I will let you try.
Yeah, I'm looking at the time. All right, 2 minutes on this. I've been incredibly lucky. I got to work with Roger Fisher. I met Tom Schelling through him. I got to work with Howard Rafa, just the titans of the field. But then I met Chris, and to me, I put him in that same group. I think he's done tremendous benefit to our field. And I first met him, when he was still working in the FBI. He had a knee surgery, and so he was off duty, and he came up to take the negotiation workshop at Harvard Law. And he was in Sheila's class. And Sheila, would always have a class party at our house so the students could get to know each other. And I came home while this was happening, and I went into the kitchen. There was one beer left, and I was like, "Ha!" And I grabbed that beer. And Chris came into the kitchen. I didn't know who he was, but he was just holding a cup, and he just kind of looked at me sadly and almost imperceptibly wiggled the cup. And I just kind of watched myself pour him half the beer. And then I was like, wait, why did I do that? And it was like seeing a magician do a trick. And it made me say, like, okay, I gotta find out how does he do this stuff. And one big aha moment was I got to go teach with Chris in Abu Dhabi. They were teaching hostage negotiation. And it was kind of a ride along for me, because I'm not an expert hostage negotiator, but I could talk about the research and, oh, actually, here's where Kahneman and Tversky back up exactly what you're saying and that kind of thing. And one of the things I saw is that they got very rapid behavioral change. And um, it was the fact that part of it was breaking down the micro skills. And part of it was, their time allocation was maybe 10% lecture and 90% drill, just practicing again and again. And you practice in front of the class. And once you've done all these 8 skills on the active listening checklist, you're allowed to leave and go have a cup of coffee. And until then, you're still stuck in front of the class, in front of everybody. And that was so powerful that it made me think of, well, how can we try to recreate that in a private setting where you don't have, 5 expert hostage negotiators, right on top of you, making you do this stuff. And, this book is our attempt to do that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I think you have succeeded admirably. I highly, highly recommend the book to everyone on this call. Over 300 people at peak time. And once again, the video of today's event will be posted on our website in about a week in case you joined late or would like to review something, as well as the slides and handouts that Attia mentioned. I will close out by saying that we have 3 more events in the next 3 weeks here at the Pergamon Negotiation. We're busy wrapping up the academic year, like many of you, starting this Thursday with our 3 graduate research fellows who will be presenting the work that they've been doing here during their time at PON over the course of this academic year. And then we will have another book talk with Sarah Federman on corporate reckoning on May 11th. And then Tamaris Fakori of Tufts University will be with us on May 19th. So we look forward to seeing many of you at future events. John and Attia, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and all of your energy and all of the questions, including all those I couldn't get to. You have their contact information to ask them directly. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Nicole. And thanks to
Thank
everybody in the
you.
audience.
Thank you all. It was great being here.
Thanks.